So you have learned that in Redux, actions should be plain objects with a type property. So I've cleaned up the code in index.js. Here we have a store object. If we call store the dispatch and give it an object, but without a type property, you're going to get an error. Take a look. So actions may not have an undefined type property. So in Redux, actions should be plain objects with a type property. By the same token, we cannot dispatch a function here. So if you dispatch a function, we get this error. Actions must be plain objects. Use custom middleware for async actions. Now you might be wondering why we want to dispatch a function in the first place. Well, this function allows us to do some really interesting things. For example, here we can call an API endpoint. You know that when we are calling APIs, we deal with promises. So when the promise is resolved, then perhaps we want to dispatch an action, and that action would contain the result of our API call. Alternatively, if we get an error, if the promise is rejected, then we want to dispatch another action that would indicate some error. So in this function, we can have some logic. We cannot do this with plain objects, right? So here's the thing. We can give the store the ability to dispatch functions by writing a middleware function. Let me show you. So here in the middleware folder, let's add a new file. I'm going to call this func, as in short for function. So func.js. Let's create a middleware function. Now remember the parameters, S, N, A. So store goes to next, goes to action. And then we're going to export this function as a default object. Now, in this middleware function, we can check the type of the action that is passed. For example, in this code, the type of this action is function. So here we can type if type of action equals function, then we're going to call this function, right? Because this is not a plain JavaScript object. It's a function, so we can call it. Otherwise, if it's a plain object, we're going to pass it to the next middleware function or the reducer. So we pass it as an argument, okay? Now let's register this middleware function. So save the changes. We go to configure store.js. On the top, we're going to import it. Import func from middleware/func. Then we add it in the array of middleware functions. So first we have our logger, and then we add our func middleware. Now note that the order of these functions matter. So with this structure, every action goes through these middleware functions in order, okay? Now let's test our implementation. So here on the console, that error is gone. So we could successfully dispatch a function. Now back in this function, let's imagine that we called our API, got some result, and now we want to dispatch an action that contains the result of our API call. So we can call store.dispatch. We dispatch a plain object. Let's set its type to bugs received. So we receive the bugs from the server. Now here for the payload, we can add another property, bugs, with an array of 3 numbers, just for simplicity. Save the changes. So here we have 2 actions. The first action was the function that we dispatched, and the second action is the action that contains the result of our API call. Now, let's go to the Redux tab. Here's the action that we dispatched, and here we have the bugs that we've received from the server. Now, we have a tiny problem here. In this file, in index.js, we have access to this store object, and that is why we can easily call store.dispatch. But somewhere else in our application, let's say in our action creators, we do not have access to this store object. If we import this function from the configure store module and call it again, we get a different store object. So to make this more flexible, we should pass a reference to the dispatch function over here. So back in our middleware function, you know that this store parameter is an object with 2 methods, dispatch and getState. So here we can use object destructuring to pick these 2 methods, dispatch and getState. And then we can pass this as arguments to this action. So we pass dispatch and get state. Now, back in index.js, this function that we're passing to the dispatch method takes two parameters. The first one is the dispatch function, and the second one is getState. Now, we're going to replace store.dispatch with dispatch. So back in the console, we don't have any problems. Our application is working as usual. Beautiful. Now with getState, we can also get the current state of the store. This is useful in situations where we want to do some decision making. For example, before making an API call, we look at the store. If the data that we have is already there, then there is no need to refetch it from the server, okay? So for this demo, let's quickly log what we have in the store. So we call getState and then log the result. Take a look. So this is what we currently have in the store. We have entities, bugs, projects, and users. All these arrays are empty because I temporarily removed all the code for dispatching actions that populate these slices. So with this simple middleware, we can easily dispatch functions, and that allows us to make asynchronous API calls. That doesn't mean that in every application we have to create this middleware from scratch. The answer is no. This middleware is already built for us. It's called Thunk. It's not Funk, it's Thunk. Now, where does the name come from? It's a humorous past tense version of think. It's a made-up word. Now, here's what you need to take away. If you're using Redux Toolkit, you automatically get this middleware. That is another reason why I think you should use Redux Toolkit in every application. Otherwise, if you're not using Redux Toolkit, you need to manually install Redux Thunk and then register it as a middleware function. Now, let me show you something. Back to configure store.js, I'm going to remove this Thunk middleware because I told you that Redux Toolkit automatically brings Redux Thunk. So we also want to remove it from this array. Save the changes. Now, back in the browser, we get this error. Actions must be plain objects. So what happened to the Thunk middleware? Well, we actually lost it because with this configuration, we are overwriting the array of middleware that is automatically configured in Redux Toolkit. So to solve this problem, on the top, we need to import a function called getDefaultMiddleware. Now, when initializing this array, first we have to call getDefaultMiddleware. This returns an array of middleware functions. So we need to use the spread operator to copy all those items into this array. And then we add any extra middleware functions. Okay? Now, save the changes. Back in the console, the error is gone. So Redux Toolkit automatically brings Redux Thunk for us.